A very warm welcome to our viewers at today's online segment presented by Leicester Politics Society. We have got a special guest with us, and I take great pride in introducing her to our audience. Joining us today is Barbara Serra, who's an award-winning journalist, author, and a TV news presenter with 20 plus years of experience for the world's leading broadcasters. Currently at Sky News, as a news anchor, she's also been a presenter for BBC, Channel 5, and Al Jazeera. She was also awarded a knighthood by the Italian government for her work in international journalism. Lastly, she became the first non-native English speaker to present a primetime news program on the British television. So we shall discuss and touch upon topics such as, barriers in broadcast journalism, Brexit, UK politics, and fascism. So thank you so much, Barbara, for agreeing to be a part of this interview.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and it's great to be with you.
Oh, you clearly deserve it, not a problem. Moving on to our first question. How strongly do you believe the media and broadcasting industry favors accent bias? How difficult does it get for non-native English and bilingual speakers when it comes to being, recruited, when it comes to recruitment by top media channels?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that question, because it's something that I've been doing a lot of work on. And just to give context to some of the viewers and listeners right now, I am not a native English speaker. I'm an Italian native speaker. I started learning English when I was about 9, but in Denmark at an international school, so it's all a bit odd. Was probably fluent by 11, and then came here to the UK for uni at 19. So I sort of have a very mixed linguistic background, but I very much remember not being able to speak English. It's one of my clearest memories from my childhood, and remember learning it. And then obviously, in 30 years in the UK, I think you can still tell I'm foreign born, but my English, I like to think is fluent, otherwise it'd be a problem for my work. So listen, the question of accent bias is a varied one. I focus on the issues that non-native English speakers feel. So basically anyone whose mother tongue is not English. But we know that in the UK, up until not that long ago, even a lot of regional accents weren't really heard on TV, right? Even among the regional accents, there were some that were sort of privileged accents and others that you just wouldn't hear, for all sorts of stereotypes that I'm not going to get into, because I'm probably not the best person to talk about that. But so the issue of accent is something that's been around for a long time now. When it comes to regional UK accents, I mean, some may disagree with me, but I think we are way ahead now than we were 20 years ago. I actually think that the accents that used to be quite in vogue, that very much received pronunciation, borderline sort of, Queen's English, I think that's very rare now. And I think it just doesn't sound like things that we hear in real life. I mean, even the royal family doesn't sound like the Queen sounded 50 years ago, right? So I think that's been a change. I think in the meantime, two things have changed. One, the number of foreign-born people in the UK. And again, foreign-born can cover an enormous amount of things. It can be people like me who came here young, but as adults. It can be a lot of people that came here as children. So maybe, yes, their mother tongue was something else, but actually they learned English when they were 4, and so effectively are perfectly bilingual. It can be people that come here and still don't speak English, in a lot of communities, especially, let's say, women. Sometimes it's harder if you don't have a job and you stay within the family environment. So that can cover a lot of things. And one thing I've noticed in media, obviously in British media, but I have to say in international media as well, which maybe might surprise you, is that there is I don't like using words like bias, discrimination, privilege, because it almost implies that it's done on purpose. And I don't think it is done on purpose. I'll tell you what, I will use the word privilege, because I do think that speaking English is a privilege, because it's like the key to anything that we could call the international community. And speaking English as a native language is a privilege, because, it's your main language, your accent is perfect. Speaking English with a kind of middle of the road, posh but not too posh British accent is kind of like top of the absolute tree, because it kind of opens all sorts of doors. And in something like broadcast journalism, any form of communicating, but especially broadcast journalism, language is your tool. you cannot compromise on that. You cannot be unclear. You know, I'm all for, and obviously, again, there have been massive changes to this diversity and inclusion, of course, but you have to have that skill. So especially for second language English speakers, the first thing I always ask anyone is, okay, how much of it is language and how much of it is accent? So how confident are you in your English, in your vocabulary, in your clarity? You know, it's all about clarity. So, I mean, I used to play this game where I used to like look at all the TV channels and go, okay, who is not a native English speaker? And there would be very few. And sorry, I've had a cold, a terrible cold, so my accent is worse than usual because I'm super nasal. So I've had this flu for 3 days. And by native English, I don't mean British. I mean, you know, Irish, Australian, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, any kind of English that is native, but you know, not necessarily rooted in the UK. And I do think it's an aspect of diversity that people don't really notice. And I think if we're going to try to have a global conversation, it's great to include people, you know. I mean, I consider myself in a way when it comes to Europe that have different heritages. That's great. The point is that if you're only going to choose people who sound like native speakers or are native speakers, there's still an imprint, right? So I speak good English. Well, why? Because I started studying in English from the age of 9. And I wasn't just studying the English language, I was studying, you know, English history and English literature and English, I don't know, history of the arts or drama or even geography. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but everything will have a national slant, right? So even if you're studying geography, depending on where you are in the world, you're kind of studying slightly different aspects. I mean, the world is still the same, but you're looking at different aspects. And so I think it's something that needs to be addressed. I mean, I have an online course, but I've done a lot of mentoring with a lot of journalists in trying to help them through it. I am not an English teacher. I never pretend to be, but I think a lot of it goes well beyond it. And to me, it's about finding your authentic voice. So the advice that I would give to anyone who is either a second language English speaker or just isn't confident with their you know, use of English is focus on 2 things. One is clarity. So be really honest with yourself, and it's always painful. I mean, it just listening back to yourself is always awful. But be honest with yourself about what isn't clear, but then also find your authentic voice and know that actually there's a reason why you sound like you sound. And so bring all the different backgrounds and heritages and influences that have made you sound the way you sound into what you actually say. So to me, it's twofold. I think it's something that's getting better. I've noticed even just in the past year, especially at the BBC, you're hearing more and more truly different voices. I like to think maybe all my drumming on about this is landing in front of the right people. But yeah, that would be my issue, because to me, it is a key issue of diversity, and ultimately, you know, different voices is just that, listening to people that genuinely have, you know, different voices. But there is a genuine obstacle. That's what I mean. It's not just bias. You know, your English has to be good enough, and that takes work.
Moving on to our second question. Europe since the last decade has seen a sharp rise in the
Wait,
far right.
Can I stop you there? Can I just ask what you think? Has that ever resonated with you or people, you know, like in your age group, or is that something that you've...
I mean, I think I remember reading your article as well on the accent bias a couple of months ago, and it really resonated with me as well, because someone who doesn't have a British accent or standardized, you know, something, as you said, like something that the royal family or the Queen speak, and my accent is nowhere near that. But then it's just the vocabulary and stuff. So I feel like even someone like me could not make it or like probably couldn't cut it to the media industry as well, just because of on the basis of accent?
You know what, though? I think, let me just, I'll pick you up on that and we'll go on to the other question. I think you absolutely could. I mean, the example I made of the Queen, you know, that's 20, 30 years ago. I do think that now you just hear different voices. And I think you are very, very clear. But it's interesting how it's almost a lack of confidence. I hope you'll forgive me saying it. But, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, that actually, as long as you're clear, and I think then, you know, all of us can always improve on that. I mean, even native speakers, you know, all broadcasters tend to do quite a lot of voice training. So this isn't, you know, everybody does it because it's your skill. Why wouldn't you train it, right? But yeah, I think it's the realization that you can sound different as long as you're clear, but then it's having the confidence. Because I think, I mean, I think you sound perfect, but I know what you mean, that maybe you would feel like, okay, I'm not like, I don't know, what would be the word mainstream? I don't know, but you know, that you feel that, but actually I think you absolutely could and should try. And actually what I also think should happen is that the networks who do spend a lot of, you know, they invest in people and they train. And I think they need to be honest with people, because I think what I found, and the reason I do a lot of mentoring is because when I was starting out about 1,000,000 years ago, I remember the way you said 20 plus years experience sounds very old, because it is. But, you know, it wasn't addressed, and I didn't have anyone to look up to apart from one woman at CNN that was from Romania, but that was CNN and I was in the UK. So I think it's up to the networks as well to kind of develop people. But, you know, for whatever my opinion is worth, I think you would, if you wanted it, you would be absolutely fine in UK media because things are changing.
Moving on to our second question. That was actually perfectly fine, because I love the insight. Yeah, because I think I could, and probably the others being online as well, can resonate with your thoughts as well.
I have to say that I've been amazed. I mean, you'd be amazed how many emails I got and how many messages, and how from the corners of the world, you know, through the Al Jazeera audience, I have quite a global, you know, Al Jazeera was very global. So, you know, I have a lot of connections, and the words that you used that resonated with you, I heard that a lot, which makes me happy. Not happy that it's a problem, but happy that it's resonating. Okay, we can definitely go to question 2 now.
Europe, since the last decade, has seen a sharp rise in the far-right anti-immigrant political parties. There's been some in the Netherlands as well. There's one, I think, coming up in Portugal as well. So in the UK, we have seen a notion regarding that, which was called as Brexit, a very Eurosceptic notion as well. So how significant were the effects of Brexit on your daily life, and perhaps if you could share something from it?
Look, you know, I work as one of the jobs I do is as a newsreader. So, you know, I'm bound by Ofcom to be duly impartial. I can tell you as an EU citizen living in the UK that, you know, Brexit was a little bit heartbreaking, because there is, I don't think you would speak to any EU citizen who's lived here for a long time that didn't see it as a sense of rejection. But I do think that there were a lot of things at play. I think there were a lot of reasons why the people who voted for Brexit voted as they did. I don't think they are all rabid anti-EU, you know, skeptics or anti-migrants. I think a lot of things went in, and I think it was a signal of a discontent that people felt with how some things were working. And maybe EU migration to the UK was part of that, right? One of the things that they were unhappy about. And you mentioned the rise of the far right across Europe. Again, that's a very complicated issue. We use this term far right. I think a lot of these parties, you know, they will have specific national reasons for existing and specific national points they go for. Certainly immigration is an issue in a lot of countries, like my native country, Italy, for example, who is very much, you know, an island like Lampedusa, gets a lot of migration from North Africa. So that is something that, you know, is a real issue, because then you have to, you know, cater and take care and make sure that you you know, you don't just dump a lot of these migrants that arrive in just holding centers. You know, you have to create a structure for them to either integrate or for their asylum policies to be processed. So it's a big issue. What impact has Brexit had? I think I think for EU citizens, it's been, like I said, heartbreaking. I think I decided I wanted to make this country my home. So by total chance, 6 years before Brexit, I applied for British citizenship. So I am a dual national. But of course, a lot of Europeans don't do that because apart from anything else, applying for nationality is expensive. I mean, you're not going to see a lot of change from £2,000. And not all EU countries allow you to have dual nationality. So you can't just apply it and get it. I was quite lucky that both Italy and the UK let you have dual nationality. And so for all the EU citizens here who didn't have British nationality, apart from this feeling of slight alienation and othering, you had the very realistic worry that you didn't know what your eventual status was going to be. Now, it was very unlikely that any government was going to kick out Europeans en masse, but at the same time, it is something that is worrying. We should never, ever take our passports for granted, our rights to live in a country for granted, because at Al Jazeera, I did a lot of stories from a lot of places where that can just be ripped away from you. And there's nothing more scary than not having a functioning passport and not feeling that you can actually, either go back home or stay in the country that you call home. So I think for most EU citizens, that was the real upsetting bit. There's this thing called settled status, and the numbers are huge. So settled status is what EU citizens applied to, which gave them, in fairness to the government, which gave them pretty much the same rights that they had before Brexit. But it's not quite the same. And sometimes there's glitches and there's lots of stories you hear, people getting stuck at the border, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So look, Brexit has obviously had its issues. Even people who supported it from the beginning would say that maybe it wasn't quite the way they thought it would turn out. COVID, right after the official Brexit, obviously changed everything as well. And I think as a country, we're still sort of adapting to the post-Brexit Brexit world. So hopefully we'll eventually be okay.
I mean, I had spoken to a number of MPs, councillors, even people working in think tanks regarding the Brexit issue. And as you said earlier, the point that they raised is that, yes, we wanted a Brexit, but we wanted like a well-planned Brexit, not a hard one. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Brexiteers sort of like moved on to the position. And probably that could be seen in the current UK politics as well. There's a lot of hate for the Conservatives at the moment.
I mean, always remember that a lot of people, though, in this country did vote for Brexit. And I always bear that in mind as someone who, maybe as an EU citizen felt, that sense of hurt. I mean, you look at the numbers, it's a big chunk of the country that voted for Brexit. And you can't just ignore and you can't just say that they were wrong. I don't say that they were wrong. I may be upset by the ultimate decision, but it's not for me to tell someone that the way they vote is right, right or wrong. I do think it just kind of got mixed up. I think the world changed from that vote. That's what I always think. And as a journalist as well, remember that we voted for Brexit. We had the vote before Donald Trump got into the White House. I mean, literally, even just a few months later, the world changed. And then so many other things have changed. And now, then COVID got there. And now there's a war with Russia. And the EU itself is having issues. And then, instability in the Middle East. And I just think, we will never know what Brexit would have looked like in a very, very stable world. So that's, I mean, it's been discussed at such length. I'm not sure that I could add anything vaguely incisive beyond that. But yeah, I think now it's just a matter of kind of getting on with it. I'm not particularly in favor of the idea of a second referendum. Not now. I think, we make our peace with what has been done.
So you say it's the best thing just to move on now?
Listen, as I've said, I think for the fourth time now, personally, as an EU citizen, I find Brexit heartbreaking. But I think, we had the vote, people spoke, you can't keep on voting. I think another referendum now might end up being even more disruptive. And what I care about most of all is unity within the UK. I think our country, this country, I know I have two, but I still see this obviously as my country. I feel there are a lot of divisions, and I think there's a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of injustice. And I feel that actually a second referendum would add to that. So, it's not my decision to make.
Barbara, moving on to our last question for today's segment. When Giorgia Meloni was elected in the year 2022, fears rose about the revival of fascism in Italy. However, she's managed to distance herself from the sort of neo-fascism idea. So what are your opinions on this move?
Yeah, so I've written about it quite a lot because when it happened, I think my phone didn't stop ringing for about 3 weeks with interview requests. I mean, not that I'm particularly special, but obviously, if you're an Italian journalist that speaks English, your phone is going to ring a lot when Italy elects its first government with neo-fascist roots. I think there was an issue of misunderstanding and overhyping, and I'm not in any way excusing Giorgia Meloni here, but let me just explain. I think her party absolutely has neo-fascist roots. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. She has certainly made in the past, in her youth, but comments where she says Mussolini was a good leader in many ways. But crucially, there are certainly members of her party or groups aligned to her party, that still have what in Italy is called nostalgia for fascism, which is a bit of a euphemism if you ask me, but there you go. But I do think that the way that was kind of transcribed in the English press, again, it goes back to my issue of language, the same words, the same phrase in different languages, because it's different cultures, resonate in a different way. And so it was a little bit like, oh my goodness, Italy is going back to fascism. We're going to have troops marching down in Rome. And that I don't think was ever going to happen. There's no risk to democracy as such in Italy. But I think what you are seeing, there's a few things. For example, this nostalgia of fascism, you're seeing more and more emboldening of the very, very small splinter groups, that has to be said, but they're there and they are emboldened to, for example, I don't know, mark key dates in the fascist calendar. A few months ago, there was this pictures that did the rounds of, a massive, about 150 neo-fascists in Rome doing the Roman salute, the raising of the arm, commemorating an event there from decades before. So I think that is happening. More worrying, I do think there is a slight suppression of dissenting voices. And so that is those are the bits that I worry about. She has certainly proved herself to be a valuable ally to Rishi Sunak, to Joe Biden in the war in Ukraine. And, with Sunak, or, with any British government, realistically, whoever comes in, it's this pan-European approach to, whether it's controlling migration, decreasing migration, trying to regulate migration, whatever. Migration is an issue, so they need her. So, do I think, I think she has certainly proved some of her critics wrong, but because I think some of the critics were looking at the wrong things. I think if you look at some other things, so for example, a sort of freedom of expression in Italy, then I do think there are some worrying signs. Italy has a free press, don't get me wrong. It's not that kind, it's not a dictatorship. But there are pressures because of a particular system that you have in Italy that perhaps her party and her big coalition are using to their advantage to suppress voices. It is much easier and you have less risk if you're criticizing the government in the UK than if you criticize the government in Italy.
Well, that largely brings us to the end of our discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to host you online, Barbara, and I'm sure all the experiences and insights that you've shared should probably aid students a lot. And thank you for turning up, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
No, well, thank you. Thank you for asking me to be part of this, and good luck.